was just another shift at the corner gas station, the kind where the hours crawl by and the smell of burnt coffee mixes with the hum of the fluorescent lights. I'd been working late for weeks, trying to save up some cash for the holidays. Around 2:30 a.m., the doorbell chimed, and in walked the man, thin, pale, with a wrinkled coat that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I didn't think much of it at first. It was late, and we'd get all sorts in here at this hour. He shuffled up to the counter, pulling out an old, tattered wallet. I couldn't help but notice the coins inside. They weren't regular coins, they were thick, made of some dark metal, and each one had strange markings, almost like ancient symbols. He looked at me with this blank stare, like he was seeing something far away. He set down the coins, one by one, and when I picked them up, they were freezing cold. My fingers tingled as I slid them into the register, but the man didn't blink. His eyes were wide and glassy, and I felt an uneasy shiver crawl down my spine. He didn't say a word, just nodded when I handed him his change and shuffled back out the door. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the weirdness, but I couldn't. I kept staring at the coins in the drawer. Something about them felt wrong. The days started to bleed together after that. The coins, no matter how many times I ran them through the register, kept showing up. At first I thought maybe I had just missed one when the guy paid. He'd handed me a lot of change. But then it happened again and again. Each time I opened the drawer, there was another coin. They didn't seem to age. No matter how many times I tried to wipe them down, the same strange markings were there. I thought I was losing my mind. So I decided to confront it head on. After the store closed one night, I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check the parking lot. Maybe, I thought, the man had dropped something while leaving. But when I stepped out into the cold, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. There, under the dim light of the street lamp, was a figure standing by the edge of the lot. The man. He didn't move, just stared at me with those cold, unblinking eyes. My heart slammed against my chest as I froze in place. I was sure he hadn't been there when I first stepped out. I took a step forward, but the moment I did, he disappeared into the dark. I rushed back inside, but that wasn't the worst part. As I turned the key to lock the door behind me, I glanced down at the counter. More coins, at least 5, had appeared, as if someone had slipped them under the register. I didn't know what to think anymore. All I knew was that I was being watched. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, needed to know what the hell was going on. That night I waited in the back of the store, crouched behind the counter, the register glowing faintly in the dark. I told myself I'd leave once I saw him. This time, I wasn't going to let him slip away. Around 3 a.m., the door chimed. The same man walked in, his pale face barely visible under the brim of his hat. His coat looked even more worn, like it had been through 100 storms. But this time, he wasn't alone. There was something else, something watching me from behind him. A shadow, shifting unnaturally, like it didn't belong. He stepped up to the counter, placing another coin down, but this time his hands were trembling. "I need you to keep it," he whispered. "They're all around. They won't stop until they have all of them." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The air felt thicker, like something pressing in from all sides. My body was frozen as his eyes locked onto mine. Before I could ask him what he meant, the shadow behind him lunged, and I was blinded by a sharp, cold sensation. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, just stared at him as the world seemed to distort around me. He didn't flinch. I blinked, and suddenly the man was gone. The coins were scattered across the counter, cold as ice. I staggered back, gasping for air, but when I went to grab the phone to call for help, the screen flickered. Faint, ghostly images flashing across it. The last one was a picture of me, standing in the store, looking back at the camera. I never went back to that station. I couldn't. The man, or whatever he was, had left something behind, something I still don't understand. All I know is that sometimes, late at night, I hear coins clinking outside my window. I was working the late shift at the hospital. It was a ghost shift. Nights were always quiet, especially in the old wing. The new section was always busy, bustling with doctors and nurses, but the old wing? It was like a forgotten part of the building. The walls were cracked, the lights flickered constantly, and the air smelled stale. My job was simple. Just monitor the equipment, make sure everything was running, and fill out paperwork when the shifts overlapped. It was routine, boring, until that night. It started with a simple, innocuous thing. The PA system crackled, then emitted a strange series of codes. Gibberish, really. The kind of numbers no one would hear unless they worked the night shifts in a hospital like this. I glanced at the monitor to check if it was coming from the patient rooms, but it wasn't. This was from the PA system itself. I shrugged it off. Hospitals were old. Sometimes the equipment did weird things. But then it happened again, and this time, the codes weren't random. They were repeating themselves, and they were getting louder, sharper, like they were desperate for someone to hear. I grabbed the receiver and pressed it to my ear. "Hello?" I called, but the static on the other end swallowed my voice. The codes continued, faster now. Panic started to creep in. I wasn't alone in the hospital. There were patients and security. I wasn't supposed to be scared. But then came the message, clear as day. Room 112, help them. I wasn't supposed to go to room 112. It was part of the old wing, a place the hospital had shut down years ago. We only used it for storage now. But when I heard that message, I couldn't ignore it. It felt like a command, like something in the air had shifted. I grabbed a flashlight and started walking toward the back of the hospital, past the deserted wards and the peeling paint. The closer I got to the old wing, the colder the air became, and the silence grew thicker, more oppressive. The hospital felt wrong at night, but tonight it felt alive. As I turned the corner to the abandoned hall, I felt that familiar sense of dread creep into my chest. The faint hum of the PA system was still there, but now it was quieter, more distant, like it was coming from another world. When I reached the door to room 112, the light was flickering above it, just a stuttering flash of brightness in the dark hallway. I pushed the door open, the sound of it creaking like something ancient, and stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a single, rusted hospital bed in the center. It looked like no one had been in there for years. But there was something else, something I couldn't explain. On the floor in the far corner of the room was a notebook. I walked over to it and flipped it open, and the first thing I saw was a name, Catherine Winters. It was written in neat, looping handwriting, but the pages were filled with strange diagrams and codes, like a journal. And then, under the last entry, written in bold letters, "The shadow will find you." I shivered, closing the book, but the message didn't leave me. Something was off about this room, something was wrong with the codes, and it was all connected to this name. I turned to leave, but as soon as I did, the door slammed shut behind me. The air in the room turned icy cold, and I felt a sudden pressure on my chest, like I was being held down by something unseen. My breath quickened, panic rising in my throat. I stumbled backward, feeling the room closing in around me, and that's when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper coming from the corner where the notebook had been. "Help them, help me." I spun around, but there was no one there. No one except the shadows. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. I pulled out my phone, but the screen wouldn't respond, just static. I was trapped, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The walls. They were moving, slowly but unmistakably. Something in the paint seemed to be alive, creeping across the surfaces, like veins spreading through the old plaster. Then I saw it. A figure barely visible, standing at the foot of the bed. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that didn't seem to bend right. It was watching me. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the endless static that filled the air. The figure stepped forward, its face hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes boring into me. My heart pounded in my chest. Before I could make sense of what was happening, the PA system crackled to life again. The same voice from earlier, but now clearer, distorted as if it was coming from the depths of the earth. Room 112, forever, no escape. I ran through the hallways, my mind racing, my breath sharp in my ears. When I reached the front desk, I turned back. The doors to the old wing were wide open, but there was no sign of anyone inside. No lights, no sounds, just emptiness. The PA system was silent now, as if nothing had ever happened. I left that night. I never spoke of it to anyone, but every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers, and I wonder, what happened to Catherine Winters? I was just doing my job, delivering packages in the dead of night, the kind of job where you don't ask questions. The route had been the same for months, but that night was different. I got a strange address, one that wasn't on my usual GPS, not even on the map I had pulled up on my phone. At first, I thought it was some mistake, a glitch. But the package I had was small, light, and seemed urgent, so I didn't question it too much. It was just a few more miles, I figured. I drove down a long, winding road, surrounded by dense trees on either side, the headlights barely cutting through the darkness. The address led me deeper into the rural area, where the streetlights were few and far between. I saw no signs of life, just the occasional flicker of a distant porch light. After what felt like an eternity, I pulled up to the address. There was a house there, or at least what should have been a house. I had to stop the truck and blink a few times to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. The house was old, but well kept. 2 stories, painted a faded blue, with a porch that seemed to sag slightly under its weight. The weird thing? There was no street number, no mailbox, no visible signage of any kind. I double-checked the address. Same one as in the system. This couldn't be right. I looked around. No signs of any other houses nearby. It felt like I was the only one on this stretch of road. But there I was, standing in front of a house that shouldn't have been there. I grabbed the package and walked up to the front door. My footsteps echoed in the stillness, and the air felt unnaturally still, almost suffocating. The house loomed before me, its dark windows reflecting nothing but the empty night. No lights inside, no movement, not a sound. It was like I was standing in front of a forgotten relic, abandoned by time. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time, still no answer. I hesitated, then tried the handle. To my surprise, the door opened easily. I shouldn't have gone in, but something about the place drew me in, like it was waiting for me. Inside, the house was dim and musty, filled with the scent of stale air. The living room was completely still, furniture covered in white sheets, as if the house hadn't been lived in for years. The hardwood floors creaked beneath my feet, and I could hear the faintest sound of something moving upstairs. But it was too soft to be anything solid. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" Silence. I glanced at the package again. Room 233, that's where it was supposed to go. But the house was only 2 stories, no 3rd floor, nothing to suggest that a room 23 even existed. I felt that tightness in my chest again, that unease creeping up my spine. Maybe it was a mistake, I thought. Maybe I was in the wrong house. But no, everything matched up with the address I'd been given. Suddenly I heard a door creak open. It was upstairs, and the sound of it was heavy, deliberate. Footsteps followed, slow, heavy steps, like someone was pacing. My heart started to race. My first instinct was to leave, but the door was still open, and something about the place made me feel like I needed to find this room. I slowly made my way toward the staircase, my footsteps uncomfortably loud in the silence. The steps were steep, and the air grew colder with each one I took. The upstairs hallway was dark, the walls lined with old, faded portraits that seemed to watch me as I passed. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to leave, but I kept moving forward, driven by something I couldn't explain. At the end of the hall was a door, slightly ajar. My pulse quickened as I approached. Room 203, the package label had said, but there was no sign of a number on the door, no markings at all, only the faintest trace of what looked like dust. Disturbed recently. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The room was unlike the rest of the house. It wasn't covered in sheets, and it wasn't covered in the stale smell of abandonment. Instead, it was immaculate, furnished, clean, almost like it had been waiting for someone. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn tight, and in the center of the room, a single chair facing the window. But there was something off about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. On the nightstand beside the bed was an old photograph. I picked it up, and my stomach dropped. The people in the photo were unfamiliar, but the house in the background, it was the house I was standing in. I turned around to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. The room went dark. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, but the screen was blank, dead. I could hear it again. Those footsteps coming closer. And then, the voice. "Why did you come here?" I spun around. The room was now filled with shadows, twisting and shifting, like they were alive. In the corner, a figure stood, barely visible in the dark. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it staring at me, could feel the weight of its gaze. I don't remember how I got out of the house. One moment I was standing there, heart pounding, and the next I was outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. I turned around to look back at the house, but it was gone. Just an empty field where the house had been, like it had never existed at all. I still don't know what happened. I don't know who lived there or what it was I encountered. But I do know one thing for sure. The house on that road doesn't exist anymore. And if you try to find it, you won't. It's not on any map. It never was. I had just settled in for bed after a long day at work. The clock on my nightstand read 2:15 a.m. when the phone rang. I groggily reached for it, thinking it might be my mom or a friend. But when I looked at the screen, the name didn't make sense. It wasn't anyone I knew. The number was blocked, just a string of digits with no recognizable area code. My heart skipped a beat. A strange, unmarked number calling at this hour? I should have ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me and I answered. "Hello," I muttered, my voice thick with sleep. There was a long pause. The silence stretched out, so long that I thought the call had dropped, but then a voice. Soft, barely audible, like it was being whispered through a heavy curtain. "I see you." The words sent a chill straight down my spine. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was this? How did they know I was awake? Before I could say anything, the line went dead. I sat there for a moment, the room feeling too quiet, too still. My heart was racing, but I convinced myself it was nothing, just some prank. I tossed the phone on my bedside table, turned over, and tried to fall back asleep. But the feeling of being watched lingered in the air like an oppressive weight. The next few nights were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing over my shoulder, checking the corners of the room like a kid afraid of the dark. That phone call still haunted me. Who was it? And what did they mean by, "I see you"? Then, on the fourth night, it happened again. The phone rang, the same blocked number flashing on the screen. My breath caught in my throat. This time, I didn't hesitate. I picked it up immediately, half expecting the same chilling whisper to come through. But there was nothing, no voice, just static. And then, after a moment of silence, I heard it, just barely, like a distant echo. "Behind you." I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the room was empty, the same empty bedroom I had been in every night. My pulse was racing, my hands shaking as I gripped the phone. Who the hell was doing this? Was someone watching me? I checked the locks on my windows and doors, all secure, nothing unusual, but the feeling of being watched was growing stronger, like invisible eyes were following my every movement. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to take action. I called the police, explained what had been happening, and they assured me they would look into it. But I couldn't shake the thought that something worse was coming. Something wasn't right. That night, I sat by the window, watching the street below. My nerves were on edge, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, as if to answer my fear, my phone buzzed again. A message this time. I'm closer than you think. I ran to the door, checked the locks again. No one was outside. But that message, it was too real, too personal. I spent the next few days in a daze, my nerves frayed beyond repair. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. All I could do was wait for that next call or text, knowing it was coming. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore, like I was always a step behind whatever was watching me. And then, that night it came. The phone rang again, the same blocked number. But this time, I wasn't as scared. I'd been through this routine too many times. I answered, my voice barely a whisper. Hello? For a moment, there was nothing. Then the voice came, clear and cold. Turn around. My heart stopped. My mind raced. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew, somewhere deep down, that this was the moment. I couldn't just sit in fear anymore. I needed to see it, to know who was behind this. I slowly turned around, my body trembling with anticipation. There, standing in the doorway of my bedroom, was a man. He was tall, with dark hair and a face that seemed too familiar, though I couldn't place it. His eyes, however, were the only thing I could focus on. Cold, empty, and yet recognizable. It hit me all at once. This was someone I knew. I knew him from years ago, from a party I had gone to in college. I'd forgotten his name, but I remembered his face. He'd been a friend of a friend, someone I had barely spoken to. But he was there, staring at me through the dark. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching, his lips barely curling into a twisted smile. And then, in an instant, he turned and walked out of the room. I ran after him, my feet stumbling in a panic. But when I reached the hallway, he was gone. No sign of him anywhere. I checked the windows, the doors, everything was locked, just like before. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I later found out that the man, whose name I remembered now, had been dead for years. He died in a car accident shortly after the party. The calls stopped after that night, but every time I hear a ringing phone now, I wonder, was it really him? Or was it something else, something far worse, using his voice to haunt me? I had just moved into my new apartment, a small but cozy place in an older building downtown. It wasn't much, but it was all I could afford at the time. The place had an old charm to it, but the kind of charm that made you feel like something was a little off, like there were secrets tucked away behind the walls. But I shrugged it off. After all, what could go wrong in a city apartment? The first few nights were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking, setting up my furniture, and trying to make the space feel like home. But there was one thing that started to bother me: the apartment next door. I had never met the tenant. In fact, I'd never even seen anyone enter or leave that apartment. The hallways were quiet, and the building had an eerie, almost oppressive silence that followed me everywhere. But what unsettled me the most were the sounds coming from the wall. At first, I thought it was just normal apartment noises. Creaks, groans, maybe some pipes. But then I started to hear footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth in the apartment next door. I tried to ignore it, but the pacing never stopped. It was always there, every night, from 2 a.m. until morning. I knocked on the neighbor's door once, but no one answered. I assumed they were just a quiet, reclusive type, or maybe they were gone for the weekend. But the pacing didn't stop. In fact, it only seemed to get louder. By the end of the second week, I had grown used to the sounds, or at least I tried to, but they never stopped. The pacing was relentless, like someone was trapped in that apartment, unable to sit still. It was maddening. And then, one night, things took a darker turn. I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the wall. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or the pipes again, but then the scraping turned into a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking on the wall from the inside. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. I tried to tell myself it was just a mouse or a random noise, but the tapping was too deliberate, too consistent. It wasn't just a random sound. It felt like someone was trying to communicate. And then I heard it. Soft whispers, like someone was muttering through the wall. I pressed my ear to the cold plaster, my breath shallow. I could almost make out the words. They sounded like, "Help me, please, don't leave." I recoiled from the wall, my mind racing. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know if it was real or if I was losing my mind, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. I decided to confront my neighbor again, but this time I wasn't going to just knock. I had to know who was in there. So I went to the building manager, explained the noises, and asked if they could help me figure out what was going on. They gave me a strange look, but promised to check on the apartment. The manager disappeared into the hallway with a spare key, and I waited, my anxiety climbing higher and higher with each passing second. The manager was gone for what felt like hours. I sat in my apartment, pacing, trying to distract myself from the gnawing fear that had settled in my chest. When he finally returned, his face was pale, his expression stiff and unreadable. "We can't find anyone," he said simply. "The apartment's empty." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean, empty?" I asked, almost laughing in disbelief. "I've been hearing things. Footsteps, tapping, whispers. There's definitely someone in there." He shook his head slowly. "The apartment has been vacant for over a year. We've had a few inquiries, but no one's ever moved in. I checked. The utilities are shut off. No one's been here." My stomach dropped, and a cold sweat prickled at the back of my neck. I didn't know how to respond. What the hell was going on? That night I decided to stay awake. I had to know for sure what was happening. As the clock hit 2 a.m., the pacing started again. Slow, deliberate, and steady. But this time it was different. There was no mistaking it. Someone was walking right on the other side of my wall. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the hallway to the door of the apartment next door. It was silent now, but I knew the noises would return. I hesitated for a moment, and then, my hand trembling, I tried the doorknob. To my surprise, it turned. The door opened with a soft creak. The apartment was exactly as the manager had said, empty. But when I stepped inside, something felt horribly wrong. The air was thick with dust, and everything was frozen in time. The furniture was covered in old yellowing sheets. Yet, despite the stillness, I could hear the faint sound of breathing, like someone was standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Nothing but the oppressive silence. That's when I saw it. The wall. The same wall I had been hearing the noises through, but now there was something different about it. At the center of the wall was a strange, deep indentation, almost like a small cavity had been hollowed out from within. Without thinking, I grabbed a nearby chair and stood on it to get a better look. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness and landed on something stuck in the wall. A small, frayed piece of cloth. I reached in, my hand shaking uncontrollably, and pulled it free. It was an old, torn photograph. I stared at it for a long moment before my blood turned cold. The people in the photo were familiar. It was me and the man I had met when I first moved in. But there was something wrong with the photo. My face was scratched out. The man's face was distorted, and in the background I could see faint outlines of the apartment. But something was off. It was as though the photo wasn't just of the apartment. It was inside it. As if this place was haunting me even before I ever moved in. And then, just as my brain started to make the horrifying connections, I heard it again. The whisper, "Help me, get out." It wasn't from the wall this time. It was coming from behind me. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was the man from the photo. His eyes were wide, vacant, and his mouth was hanging open as if he was trying to scream, but no sound came out. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone, vanished into thin air. I ran out of that apartment, slamming the door behind me. I never stayed another night in that building. I moved out the next morning. But to this day, when I close my eyes, I still hear the pacing, the tapping. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel the presence of someone just behind me, breathing down my neck. I don't know who or what it is, but I know one thing for sure. That apartment wasn't empty. It was waiting for someone to find it. And now, I'm not so sure I'm the only one who ever will. It started with the mirror. I know that sounds cliche, but trust me, this was no ordinary mirror. It was an antique I found at a flea market, old, with a dark wooden frame that had intricate carvings around the edges. It looked like it belonged in a Victorian mansion, not my small, modern apartment. But for some reason, I had to have it. The first few days with it were fine. I hung it on the wall above my dresser and admired it every time I passed. It added character to the room, made it feel more homey. But then one evening something caught my eye. I was brushing my teeth when I noticed something odd in the mirror. A faint figure standing just behind me. At first I thought it was just the light playing tricks, or maybe a reflection from something in the hallway. But when I turned around to check, there was nothing there. I laughed it off, told myself it was just my imagination. But the feeling didn't go away. The next time I was standing in front of the mirror, I saw it again. This time, the figure was clearer, a shadowy form with vague features that I couldn't quite make out. It looked like a person, but not quite. I froze. My heart pounded as I stared at the reflection, waiting for it to move or fade. But it didn't. It stayed there, perfectly still. I slowly turned around, expecting to see someone standing in my room, but there was no one. The room was empty. My heart raced as I checked every corner, the closet, even behind the curtains. Nothing. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there. But now, it was closer. The figure in the mirror didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. It wasn't just standing behind me anymore. It was leaning in, almost as if it were trying to get closer to me, pressing against the glass. I could feel my breath catch in my chest, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I quickly turned away from the mirror, but the sensation of being watched lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever that thing was, it was still there, behind me. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. It was late, I was tired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. So I went to bed and tried to ignore the lingering dread that had settled in my chest. But the next morning I woke up to something worse. The mirror had moved. I don't know how. I hadn't touched it, but when I walked into the room, I saw that it was no longer centered above the dresser. It had shifted slightly to the left, as if someone had dragged it across the wall. The shift was small, but it was enough to make my stomach turn. I stood there for a moment, staring at the mirror. And then I saw it, the figure again. This time it wasn't just in the reflection. It was standing in the corner of the room, just beside the mirror. I could see its outline now, faint but unmistakable. The figure was tall, its features still indistinct, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching me with a cold, knowing gaze. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest, but the figure didn't move. It stayed in place, as if waiting for something. That's when I heard the whisper, "You can't leave." I turned to run, but before I could even reach the door, the air in the room seemed to freeze. I felt the weight of something pressing against me, as if the room itself was closing in. My breath became shallow, and I could hardly move. The whispering continued, growing louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices, all saying the same thing. "You can't leave." I stumbled backward into the mirror, and that's when I saw it. my own reflection. But it wasn't me. It was the figure. Its face was now clearer, its eyes dark and hollow, its lips curled into a sinister grin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My hand pressed against the glass of the mirror, and suddenly I felt a cold, skeletal grip wrap around my wrist. The figure in the mirror pulled me in. I don't remember much about the moments after I touched the mirror. The world around me seemed to blur, the air growing thick and heavy as if the room itself was sinking into darkness. My vision swam, and for a split second I thought I was losing consciousness. But then, a sharp, cold pain shot through my arm as if something was gripping me from the other side. I stumbled back, tearing my hand away from the mirror with a desperate jerk. But my reflection didn't move. It stayed there, unmoving, staring at me with that twisted, empty grin. I fell to the floor, my mind racing with panic. I looked up, and the figure, no longer just a shadow but a full-bodied presence, was now standing just inches from me. It was real. I could feel the cold radiating off of it, the air around me thick with its presence. It didn't say anything, but its eyes, dark, hollow, endless, seemed to pierce straight through me. I pushed myself backward, my feet scraping against the floor as I scrambled away. But no matter how much I moved, it was always closer, always there, as if it was closing in on me. Then, just as I was about to lose my mind from the sheer terror of it all, I heard a faint sound, a voice, coming from somewhere distant, muffled but growing louder. You shouldn't have touched it. I whipped my head around to find the source, but there was nothing, just the empty space around me. And then, in the reflection of the mirror, I saw it. The figure was no longer just standing there. It was moving toward me. It reached out, its skeletal fingers slowly stretching forward, inching closer to my face, like it was going to pull me into the glass. I tried to get up, to run, but my legs wouldn't work. It was as if I was frozen in place, unable to escape. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me in an incoherent mass of voices, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. I could see the figure now, right in front of me in the reflection. Its mouth opened, and the whisper came again. This time, so loud, so clear. You can't leave. You belong here. Suddenly, with an intense pull, I felt my body being yanked toward the mirror. My reflection was no longer a reflection. It was pulling me in, dragging me toward the glass like a vortex. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure's hand reaching out to touch my face. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of my apartment, still staring at the mirror. But it was different now. The figure was gone, and the mirror was just a mirror. I was shaken, my body drenched in sweat, my chest tight with fear. I jumped to my feet and backed away from it, terrified that it would pull me in again. I never touched the mirror after that. I moved out of the apartment a week later, leaving it behind. But there are nights, even now, when I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling the weight of something watching me, waiting for me to slip up. And sometimes, when I look into any mirror, I swear I see a shadow in the reflection, just for a second. It's always the same, the figure grinning. I don't know if it's really gone. Maybe it's still waiting. And I wonder, was I ever meant to leave? Or am I still trapped, staring at a reflection that isn't